Okay, hello everybody and welcome to It's Not About the Stuff, Stories Revealed at the Intersection of Genealogy and Archaeology. Featuring Joe Bagley, who's a city archaeologist for the city of Boston. Just a couple of reminders here. I'm going to ask you all to please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. There will be time at the end for a Q&A, so you can do that either through your microphone or through the chat. We will have the chat open. Okay. All right, and this program is being recorded. It is eventually going to go up on the BPL's YouTube channel. So just by way of introduction, Jill Bagley joined the City Archaeology program in 2011 as Boston's 4th city archaeologist. He curates a repository of archaeological collections at the City Archaeology Laboratory, acts as the review and compliance agent for below-ground cultural resources in the city, educates the public in archaeology through a number of city programs, manages Rainsford Island, and manages the archaeology program's social media platforms. Joe has conducted archaeological surveys from the woods of Maine down to the Florida Everglades. He specializes in Native American historical archaeological analysis and the archaeology of Boston. So without further ado, I will let Joe take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. First of all, I'd like to thank Jesse and the BPL for hosting this event. This has been a fun one to put together. It's a new topic for me. Although it's a familiar topic, and yeah, and thank you all for coming. We had amazing registration for this, and I'm seeing there's already 81 people involved. So thank you for spending any of your time this evening during these crazy times to be here. So we're gonna get right started. Shameless plugs. Oops. There we go. Shameless plugs to start. It's a library event, so let's talk books. So a little bit about the program itself. The program that I run, the City of Boston Archaeology program, was founded in 1983, and I'm the 4th city archaeologist, as Jesse's in the intro. And some recent developments was our publication of our first book, A History of Boston and 50 Artifacts, which is available at the BPL, both in print and as a digital download, if you'd like to check it out. It's the book that we wrote about archaeology and across the city. And I'm really excited to share that one of the first things I did during the COVID shutdown was finish the second book called Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them, which is going to be released from Brandeis University Press in about April of next year. The cover will look similar to A History of Boston and 50 Artifacts. I just saw a draft of it. It looks great, but it hasn't been made public yet, so you'll have to wait for that. And hopefully I can come back and do another talk next year on Boston's oldest buildings and where in the city you can find them while social distancing, of course. What I do for the city is I conduct digs and review projects to make sure that our archaeological sites are taken well care of, and that if they need to be dug, we do some digs with the public. And I'm sure some of you who are watching have been in one of our digs or participated at our lab. Very importantly, our lab is currently closed, both due to COVID, but also because another announcement, we are going to be moving. In the next 6 months or so, we will be heading out of our current location and moving downstairs, a whopping floor in the Archive Center with our friends at the Boston Archives. But in the process of building our new space, which is going to be gorgeous and brand new and fancy, we have to move out to a parking lot, which is going to be a little bit exciting to move into trailers over the winter. So you'll be hearing some updates about that through our social media, which we can share at the end. But for now, for the next 6 months or so, we're not looking for any volunteers or help, unlike normal, because we just can't accommodate anybody at the lab at all right now. So keep that in mind. But after we reopen, we're going to relaunch. Let's get into it. So what is archaeology? I don't usually define archaeology because we talk about it the entire time, but I think for this talk, it's important to kind of go over what it is because of the title. The title is It's Not About the Stuff. But what is archaeology? It's the study of human past using stuff that people leave behind. Fundamentally, what we're doing in archaeology is writing new history. At least the goal is to write new history or to re-examine existing known history about the past and about people specifically. But we do that through artifacts, and most of the time we dig them up, but it can really just be any artifact, even if it's not buried. You don't have to have it covered in dirt for it to be archaeology. But we examine what people leave behind, whether it be buildings or bodies or artifacts or trash or whatever. But then fundamentally with what we do a lot in Boston with historical archaeology is we incorporate documents and especially genealogical resources into that. So just some real background stuff. I have that big percentage up at the top. So humans have been around for about 300,000 years. Our very first writing, which was cuneiform in Sumeria, it's a tablet on the left actually from the BPL's collections. This is one of 9 cuneiform tablets at the BPL in their special collections that go back about 5,000 years or so. I'm sorry, it's about 3,000, 5,000 years or so. What that means is that the first 98% of human history, we have no written records. And the only way we can get that information about what happened in the 98% of human history is through archaeology. And that's why it's such a significant thing to have, is that we don't have that story in any other way or possible because we don't have written documents. But now we have the benefit of having written documents going forward. So what kind of written documents do we even have? We're going to be talking about genealogical resources this evening, but I think before we really go into the benefits of those, we really want to talk about the restrictions of what they have, because we don't necessarily have all of the data that's been recorded. So this is the first page of the Book of Possessions of the town of Boston. It's a 1640s to 1660s document. It's one of the oldest recorded documents that we have about Boston's history, an incredibly important resource. But Hamilton makes a really great, I'm sorry, Lin-Manuel Miranda makes a great point in Hamilton, which is who lives, who dies, and who tells your story. Because the reality is that if we're relying exclusively on written documents, who is living in those documents, who dies and recorded in those documents, but then how do those documents tell your story, our story, everybody's story, and is every story being represented equally? So I have a great quote up here at the top that the first city archaeologist in Boston, Stephen Mrozowski, who's now an archaeologist at UMass Boston and one of my mentors, he has a great quote that history is far too important to leave the historians. And what he really means by that is that history isn't just what's been written and interpreted from the written documents. It's that plus everything else. We need additional data and additional sources of research in order to get more of the story out of the written record and out of history to get to a more complete history. And that's where archaeology really comes in. Because fundamentally, you have to question every written document that you review. Who is writing the history? Who is the history about? What point are they trying to make? I'm covering up my own screen with things, sorry. Who is the audience of the story? And fundamentally, who is missing from that story? And one of the goals that we have in the archaeology program is to look at underrepresented history, folks that just don't get recorded as well. And many times that means minorities, women, children, and people who are underserviced through financial means. And so what I'm going to be focusing on quite a bit this evening is some of those underrepresented histories that are actually pretty challenging to do research on because they're so underrecorded. Because most of the history was written by men, most of the history was written by white men, by wealthy white men about wealthy white men, and so for wealthy white men. And so that means that we have a fundamentally skewed historic record as to what actually has been recorded, and archaeology can help fill in some of those gaps. So the rest of the story is about what we have left. So fundamentally, we have the stuff and we have the history that has been recorded. So what kind of history do we get? So on the right, I have a tray of about maybe 5% of one of our sites that we dug a few years ago, the Clough House out at Old North Church. And you can see that what we fundamentally get is just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of stuff. We have everything from ceramics to bone to shell to glass to more bone. And my job and the job of archaeologists is to take all those individual little pieces of data and turn them into stories. But we have the benefit in historical archaeology of adding genealogical records to that stories. And so some of the ones that we're going to talk about tonight, census records, tax records, which are really important, family trees, probate inventories, which are some of my favorite, town directories, newspapers, archives, museums, and deeds. And all of those are going to be covered. I'm not going to go into the specifics of how to do that research. But the goal tonight is to really talk about how these resources have actually changed how we interpret the archaeological sites, but also the vice versa, how the artifacts have gone back to the genealogical resources and helped us interpret the story of these sites based on the historic resources that are still surviving. There's a lot of stuff to put together, turn into a story. So tonight I'm going to focus on 4 individual sites that we've dug in Boston, 3 of them that I've dug or ran the digs myself, and then 1 of them that predates me by a few years. I'm going to do things a little bit differently than from some of my other talks. If you've been to some of my talks before, I'm going to do a lot of reading this evening. While I was in the process of writing this talk, I realized that I didn't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, and that there was many fantastic archaeologists out there that have done fantastic genealogical research coupled with historical archaeology. And I'm going to be featuring some of their research this evening. I'll be giving them full credit because I think, well, it's important, but also I know some of the folks that I'm going to be talking about may actually be joining us this evening. But I think that it's important to show that archaeology is not just me and a couple of volunteers, but a whole team of people throughout the country that are looking at Boston as an important archaeological resource. And some really fantastic researchers and archaeologists that have been looking at this data that I and others have dug up for the past about 30 or 40 years. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is our Boston Latin School Old City Hall project, which started around in 2015 in the very early spring. It was practically winter when we started. We got invited to do a dig in the very front yard of Old City Hall. I'm going to use my mouse to kind of show where we were in this kind of open space in front of Old City Hall, which was the former location of the Boston Latin School from 1635, the Boston Schoolmaster's House, which actually predates the Latin School, or 1645, excuse me, the Schoolmaster's House, which is from the late 1630s, which was a reused private home for the Schoolmaster's House, and the original King's Chapel, which would have started off as a wooden building that the stone building was then later built around. And so we were digging kind of in the area between the 2 buildings and partially on the rear of the schoolhouse and the north side of the schoolmaster's house. And just to give you an idea of what kind of trenching we were doing, this is our trenches. They're 50 centimeters wide and 2 meters long. We did these trenches because we knew that we needed to find spaces and not necessarily artifacts, because our goal for this survey was strictly to document where things were so that we could potentially come back in the future and do more surveys in areas where we found additional artifacts. So we're going to be talking about the initial results and some of the things that we'd like to do. I just want to give credit to Kathleen, who's up here in the upper part of the photo. Kathleen did all the research that I'm going to be presenting today and did a fantastic job unlocking some of the history of the story. But you can imagine these artifacts that we're going to be talking about coming out of these trenches in the lower part of the photo. So here's the source of Kathleen's work, which was presented in 2018 at the Society for Historical Archaeology event in New Orleans. That was a great conference and a lot of fun. And it's in Boston Latin School, a look at ethnic and gendered spaces, excuse me. So I'm going to read some of her work that she's done, but to talk about the site background a little bit more. So while I got pulled out of the dig for half a day to go to a meeting, and while I was in that meeting, I got a really excited text from Kathleen that was this exact photo on the left of her holding a cowrie shell. Cowrie shells are really significant in archaeological sites in the 18th and 17th century here in Boston. Sometimes they were used as trade goods, sometimes they were even used as packing peanuts, but one of the most important things that we realized from the presence of a cowrie shell is that it's a strictly West African artifact. It's something that naturally occurs off the coast of Africa, in West Africa, amongst African communities. The cowrie shell, which is called monetaria, moneta, is actually a money cowrie. So these were used as almost coinage in Western Africa, and became somewhat of a symbolic identity marker for Africans that were brought over to America as enslaved people. And may have actually been somewhat clandestine as far as their use and their presence on people's bodies. And in some ways, they can be interpreted as kind of the calling card of an enslaved person on a site. So much of what we do before we do digs is to actually do background research. When we get to a site, what we want to have done is to have done as much genealogical research and deed research to be able to document everybody that we can find who's lived on a site, and then as much as we can about them, so that when we get onto the site, we find artifacts from certain dates and we know, oh, this is so-and-so's and that's so-and-so's and they were these kinds of people, and be able to start building the story as we're out in the field about what these artifacts mean, so that we can help decide what our next steps are going to be for the dig and where we're going to be looking. This artifact totally caught us off guard, and it was a lesson that we learned about how complete our research really needs to be before we go out to the field. What we hadn't done before we went out to this dig was do the probate research on the schoolmasters that were at the house, and I could talk to you a little bit more about what we were finding from there. So with these cowrie shells, we were under the assumption that that meant that we had to have had at least one enslaved person on the site. And we hadn't been aware of that up until that point. Now, enslavement was not the rarest thing in Boston. So it's something that you can somewhat assume is going to happen on the wealthy person's site, but it wasn't something that we had looked into until we started finding the cowries. So actually after the dig, we went through and started doing the real important research. And what Kathleen was able to do, and she shows in this chart, is go through each of the schoolmasters who are on the left side of the chart and their wives, and to look up their probate records. So probate records are essentially the documents that happen, not for everybody, because you have to actually choose to do a probate, but they essentially tell descendants and the state government what items you have and where they're supposed to go, and essentially it's your will and your inventory of your property. So not everybody leaves a will, not everybody leaves an inventory, so not everybody has a probate record. It's called dying intestate, where you don't actually have your estate well planned. So many of these people on the names of the schoolmasters, we actually don't have evidence of enslaved people. You can see the question marks down the side. We're missing those probate records. However, we had one person, Nathaniel Williams and Anne Bradstreet, one couple really, whose storyline and the artifacts that we were finding really add up to one important story, which was that Nathaniel Williams, who was the schoolmaster at Boston Latin School from 1708 to 1734, had two enslaved people in their home who were present on the site, and we believe that these cowrie shells, based on the probate records, are actually evidence of these enslaved people from Africa, likely, who were brought to Boston and became enslaved in Nathaniel Williams' home as a schoolmaster of Boston Latin School. And Nathaniel Williams was quite wealthy, even as a schoolmaster. So this is what we were actually able to find in order to document that. And you'll see that in the logo for this talk. So it's the last line in the probate records. And we not rarely, I'd say about half the time we get the name of the enslaved person that is in the homes, if there is an enslaved person. Or it might be just boy, man, old man. In this case, we actually have the names of the two enslaved people, Richard and Hagar, a man and a woman, who were living in the house. And it's just, one, it's important that we say their names because it recognizes them as humans. But the other important part is that we now have a new line of research and a new interesting topic that we can then look into for the site. And unfortunately, we haven't gone back to the site, and we've done fairly minimal testing there. But were we to go back to that site, and I would love to open a huge hole in front of Old City Hall, one of the biggest things that we would be looking for is what is the story of Richard and Hagar at Nathaniel Williams's home, because their story seems to be one of the loudest stories that come out of the ground when we go to the site. When we get to an archaeological dig, based on our background research, we're really hoping to have some story come out of the ground. We're basically asking the site, what stories do you have to tell? And then we stand back and the sites speak for themselves. What artifacts are there are what we can use to actually do the interpretation, but we don't always hear the stories that we expect to hear. So going to the Boston Latin School, which was run by a man, and Latin School being an all-boys school, we really thought that this was going to be a fairly masculine site. But what we ended up finding was that it was a very domestic site where we have lots of house goods from the schoolmaster's house, not the school itself. We have the enslaved people at the home, Richard and Hagar. And then another exciting part that we ended up finding was just a huge quantity of pins. And that was another head scratcher. So pins can be used to basically staple papers back in the day. It's a somewhat common thing, but we don't necessarily believe in this case, based on its presence near the house site of Nathaniel Williams, that these pins relate to the school paper stapling, but in fact the women that were living in the house, since this would have been a very gender-based activity center at the home, with the women doing most of the sewing and learning about sewing. These are quintessential 18th century pins with the round heads that you can see in the photo. We found 304 pins, and that sounds like a lot, but I can't stress how much that really is. That's an extreme amount of pins. We dug an area that's maybe about, if you added up all the square footage of our sites of that dig, it was probably an area about 8 foot by 10 feet in square feet. And that contained 304 pins. It was overall almost 4% of all of the artifacts that we found on this site. And this wasn't a very artifact rich site. So it's basically just having the ground scream out loud about the women that were at this house. And so we went back to the data that we were finding, which was really stacking up for the early 1700s when Nathaniel Williams was there. And Kathleen started doing some really fantastic research on the Nathaniel Williams' daughters, which I'm going to read a little bit from Kathleen's work. So the daughters of Reverend Nathaniel William and Annual Bradstreet Williams were in many ways uniquely advantaged to be afforded at the very best in private education not available to girls of a lesser class. Their pedigree connected them to the elite of Boston's intellectual luminaries. No less than 2 colonial governors were instrumental in establishing Harvard, and the legacy of a very cultured and well-educated great-grandmother, Anne Dudley Bradstreet, who was the first writer in the English North American colonies to be published. The family was well connected through marriage to the Boston Latin schoolmaster John Woodbridge, and Nathaniel himself had studied under Boston Latin alumni Reverend Cotton Mather while at Harvard. So these folks are very wealthy, very well connected, and the women that were living in this house would have had extreme access to education and to domestic arts that others maybe wouldn't have had as much. So in contrast to the male experience, no formal public schooling was offered girls well into the 3rd quarter of the 18th century in Boston. One minor exception was provided to girls of higher classes, like this family. They were allowed to be privately tutored by the masters at the writing school or Latin school, but only during midday breaks from the boys' lessons. Otherwise, girls were taught reading and writing at home along with domestic skills of housekeeping, sewing, and needlework. The privilege might have taken private lessons offered at local millinery shops and private instruction in music. The quality of the education very much reflected their station, and Mary and Anne Williams, the 2 daughters of the schoolmaster, were very much gentle women. And Kathleen's research actually brought her to Elizabeth Murray's story, which is a fantastic story, who was living on Cornhill, which is a couple of streets over from Latin School on School Street. So Elizabeth Murray, who was the wife of James Murray, there's a beautiful Copley portrait of her at the MFA, was actually teaching other wealthy family girls in the nearby area how to do sewing arts. And we actually have a period sampler from one of the family that may have been a cousin of the Bradstreets, who later married into the Williams' families. So we think that this may have been a similar thing. And one of the interpretations that we actually have is that Reverend John Williams's wife may have actually been running a women's school for domestic arts out of the schoolmaster's house that was next door to the boys' school that basically escaped written record, but we have these extreme numbers of pins and needles on the site, which is really an extreme thing that we don't normally see on a regular house site. So that's one of our interpretations, was that kind of hidden in the records, or hidden from the story of the Latin school, is the story of a potential girls' sewing school for the wealthy Boston ladies, young women. Kathleen continues, Jennifer Monaghan writes, in the Uses in Literacy by Girls in Colonial America of education of Katie Mather, the daughter of Reverend Cotton Mather, who was considered the most literate man in America. The Williams sisters would have undoubtedly had shared the same social circle as Katie Mather, and their education would have followed the same practice. After her death, Katie's father remarked on her dexterity with the pen, right alongside her needlework in her memorial. She was literate in both English and Hebrew and had some Latin training, taught to her by her father to instill piety and the understanding of the Puritan faith. Like Katie, the Williams sisters' father was also a minister, and similarly, there was no male siblings for these learned men to mentor in education outside of the school. Important to note, in common to both households, was the presence of enslaved Africans who would have afforded more free time to the families who enslaved them, unencumbered by household chores. In this case, for both father and daughter to devote to the girls' education, the Williams sisters not only had exposure to their father's extensive library, but would have been heavily influenced by being raised in an academic household in close proximity, literally next door to the Latin school. So you can see how the artifacts, the pins and the cowrie shells, are telling a story that is somewhat recorded in historic documents, but those historic documents give us kind of the door opening to, the genealogy really, the door opening to this big story that's under-recorded in history, and some of these kind of hidden histories that are existing in the ground. It's certainly not as widely recognized histories. All right, I'm gonna go to another site. So if you guys have questions about these, I'm sorry, I'm gonna take them all at the end because I wanna make sure we get to everything. So the next site we're going to talk about is a site we dug a little bit after the Latin School. Have a little red X on the map at the Washington Garden at Old North, which is a large crabapple tree in an open space that was built in the 1930s. It used to be 3 houses on a street called Unity Court. And I have some background history. Tim Riordan, a local archaeologist who volunteers with me often, found this amazing article or advertisement really on the Unity Court. This is, you can't ask for better information than this. When the house was first sold, I shall sell a brick dwelling house situated in Unity Court on the block erected last season and nearest to the church, with a privilege to the passageway leading from Salem Street, blah, blah, blah. It talks about the well that we found, the rainwater cistern, a good yard, and that they can take it out on mortgage. So this is just a fantastic little piece of data that helped us better understand what we should be finding on the site, and also somewhat of the interior of the house, and that it had a parlor and a kitchen on the lowest floor, and then 4 homes and an attic above. While we were doing the deed research for the house, which is an incredibly important piece of, I wouldn't necessarily call it genealogical, but certainly our background data, we were able to find the original house allotment in the 1820s when the property was subdivided and converted into housing. So the red square represents what is the later garden area. And then it's a little bit faint to see, but this back wall here is actually the rear property of the rear of the building of the 3 buildings, number 1, 2, and 3 Unity Court. And this little rectangle that sticks out on the back was a small wooden addition off the back of the 3 properties that turned out to be the locations of the outhouse or privy, which if any of you follow anything that I do, you know how much we love privies. Because they contain so much data. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ongoing research that we've done on this property, specifically researcher Megan Sheehan, who's doing active research on this property, and some of the really interesting work that she was being able to get through genealogical research. So a bit more about the site. What you're seeing here is a view of the backyard. That kind of reddish stripe that goes across the property, that's the rear of the foundations of the house. So I'm just going to go back a slide. That's this line right here going across the back of the house. And then extending off of it, we don't have the foundations of it because there weren't any foundations, but were the additions on the back that contained the cistern and the outhouse. And you can see that here, this is this large oval shape is a cistern that would have been a rainwater cistern to collect. But we found it collected about 400 dead rats, but in addition to that, it collected the water for the family to use for things like washing up and hopefully not drinking because but in the back area here, we actually found a double privy. This would have been a complete a rectangle, sorry, shapes are hard, complete oval back in the day in the 1830s, with a wall down the middle of it, splitting the back part of the property between the number 1 and number 2 Unity Court. And the photos that you're going to see next actually are taken in this portion of the backyard where the outhouse was. This is the round outhouse that would have been under essentially the box toilet that you would have seen in the backyard. And that's where we really found the mother lode of artifacts. So these are 2 photos from one of my happiest days as an archaeologist. A very good day. I wish I could go back to that day many days. What you're actually seeing are 2 different stratas, and stratas for us are deposits. We break up strata by their color, by their texture, by their artifacts, and really one of our goals in archaeology is to find a stratified site, which means actual layered deposits, so that we can actually tell individual stories about each of those layers and not just have a million artifacts that are all mixed from everybody that's there, because then we can't tell any specific story. So on the left, strata 1, we number them as we go down. This was the first layer of artifacts that we encountered while digging in the privy, and we spent a lot of time cleaning off that surface, but you can see it's just a really dense deposit of bottles and ceramics and bones and glassware and things that would have been from the household itself. We dug through that layer, collected those artifacts, and then found a bit of a dirt break where there wasn't as many artifacts. It seemed like it was mostly soils. We later found out that the soil, that kind of crumbly texture, which you can somewhat see in the, I'm sorry, my dog's barking upstairs. You can see the crumbly texture in the ground itself. That's actually mostly seeds, and those seeds were seeds that had passed through the family and were excreted into the outhouse as bathroom, you know what. So that was mixed into all the artifacts as well. Once we found a kind of layer of soil below that, we found another huge deposit of ceramics and glass, which is this deposit here. So one of our goals, and one of the things that Megan Sheehan's actually doing for her master's thesis, is doing work to determine, can we figure out whose stories are represented by these two deposits? And that's one of the things that she was actually able to do. So for Megan's research, I'm going to read a little bit. So from 1835 to 1848, the Lyman Locke owned the property at 2 Unity Court, during which he lived in the property for the first 8 years. He was the owner, but not the occupant for the last 5 years of his ownership. Both he and his first wife, Almira Rosalind Boynton, were born in Washington County, New York. They lived in 2 Unity Court until Almira's death in 1843 of consumption. This is the last year that Lyman is listed as living in 2 Unity Court in the city's directory. So the directories that tell us everybody and where they lived each year. Lyman Locke and Almira Rosalind Boynton share a Mount Vernon Cemetery family plot in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with other members of the Locke family, including Eliza Ann Locke, Frederick Locke, and Almira Wentford, all of whom appear to be the Locke's children. The Boynton family genealogy text lists that Almira as the daughter of Luther Boynton and Abigail Parker of Washington, New Hampshire. Almira's maiden name, Boynton, also matches the family living at 3 Unity Street, which is about 6 feet away from this photo where we dug, with John Boynton as the patriarch of that family. Almira did have a brother named John Boynton listed in their family genealogy, along with a large number of people in the family of the same name. Ongoing research as part of Megan Sheehan's master's thesis is actually working to conclusively establish whether or not Almira Boynton was actually a neighbor of Lyman Locke that fell in love with him and then later married him. So that's one of our ongoing research questions. So Lyman actually occupied the property itself until the year of his wife's death, and then later moved out, or soon moved out after remarrying to another person. He maintained ownership until the year he marries Eliza Lane, and then he moves to Roxbury. The artifacts present in the lowest deposits, which are the artifacts in strata 2 on the right, they align with an 1840s date of the artifacts that we see here and the 1843 death of Almira Locke. We think, and we're working on trying to establish this as part of the ongoing research that Megan's doing, but we think that the strata 2 deposits, those cups and saucers that you see, are either the artifacts that were tossed because Lyman was remarrying and leaving, or possibly because we know that his second wife moved in with him briefly before they moved to Roxbury. It's actually possible that their second wife either decided to replace the earliest set of dishes or chose to buy new things as part of as part of getting remarried and bringing in new things to the house. So we think this is essentially a cleaning out episode of the Lyman family at the bottom of the privy that then got covered up by human waste, and then more artifacts piled on top, which is strata 1. So strata 1, the younger deposits look more similar to the 1850s in age based on the stoneware ink bottle that we found, which is right here, which dates the 1850s or 1860s because there's an advertisement actually carved on or stamped on the side of it for a property that was only open during the 1850s and 60s. During that period, George and Chester Caruth and their wives Anne and Mary Caruth, who worked at a nearby tobacco shop, lived in the property from 1849 until the early 1850s. Eli Thayer, a druggist tender, lived on the property from 1852 to 1855 and is the only resident listed on tax records and archives of Boston. So just based on the genealogical tax data and the directories that we have from the site, we're able to now separate, we think, all of the artifacts on the left-hand side from all of the artifacts on the right-hand side, not just stratigraphically in depth, but actually 2 different stories telling 2 different histories of 2 different families. So that's what we're now working on. This is kind of mid-research for Megan, who's working on completing her master's thesis right now. But it's important to show you that, like, we're not just digging up a whole bunch of stuff to get a whole bunch of stuff. We're actually trying to find individual histories and individual stories about individual peoples And so that this is one of the success stories where really detailed genealogical work actually helped us to create, I think, a really important set of artifacts that can then tell us, based on what we're seeing, how wealthy were these two families, how do they differ in style and potentially access to different goods and other cultural impacts like religion and wealth, between strata 1 deposits of potentially the Caruths and the strata 2 strata 2 deposits of the Locks. So that's going to be ongoing stuff, and we'll have an update on that today, but not today. The next work I'm going to talk about is one of my all-time favorite researchers and all-time favorite sites in Boston, which is Jade Lewis. So we're going to talk. This is one of our sites that we're actually getting a grant to digitize, the 27 to 29 Endicott Street brothel, which is covered in her dissertation, which we'll send a link out to, so you can read the whole thing. It's a fantastic study on the Endicott Street brothel. My screen is covered. Here we go. A house recommended, the sensory archaeology of sexuality, embodiment, and the creation of space in mid-19th century brothel in Boston, Massachusetts, a BU dissertation. If you want to have her give a talk about her site, she's fantastic at talking about the site. But I'm gonna share some of her results. The site, once she finished her dissertation, she turned over the collection to the City Archaeology program. We got a grant actually to digitize it. So in about 6 months or so, we're going to be releasing the 20,000 artifacts from the Endicott Street brothel online. And there's some just truly fantastic things. We're going to talk about a very small set of them, but look forward to that because it's really great. So where's the site? So Endicott Street is one of the streets that's near the north end, between the north end and what used to be called Mill Pond, which is this triangular area that was filled in the early 1804 or so. And it's now part of the Big Dig. So actually the site was one of the sites that was uncovered during the Big Dig. You can see it in the parkland here, the Greenway, under this X. What ended up happening was the archaeologists that were hired to do this dig in the early 90s were there to dig up sites related to Mill Pond and some of the early wharves that were built on the area on the edge of the shore that supported the multiple mills that were built along the Mill Pond. So at high tide, the water would fill up Mill Pond, and at low tide, they would release the water through turbines to power a bunch of mills around the edge. Unfortunately, one of the rules with the Big Dig was that the 19th century artifacts were not considered significant. So that meant that they were literally supposed to bulldoze through the 19th century archaeology on these sites. And the archaeologist team, this feature 38 down here, found a privy, which is this little rectangle. This is the rectangular version of the round one that we found in the last site that I just talked about. They found it, it was intact, it had thousands of artifacts in it, but they weren't able to dig it as part of their permits. They actually came back after work and dug it for basically fun, recorded the data off the clock, and then took the artifacts back to their company, who didn't have the funds to catalog it because it was out of the project scope. So those artifacts then eventually ended up at Boston University with Mary Beaudry, who then had used those collections for multiple theses of her students and dissertations who were working on a really important archaeological deposit. And Jade actually did some fantastic genealogical and archival research in order to document some of the, basically she was the one that established that it was a brothel. So I'm going to read from some of her work. This is from her dissertation on page 96. So the determination of the existence of a brothel at 2729 Endicott Street required several threads of evidence. The first from the 1866 tax valuation that listed Mary Lake and several other women in the neighborhood as having an occupation of prostitution. So I was able to find that exact record, and I put it up on the screen there for the house by Mary Lake. That's an interesting point because most tax records don't even record the presence of women in houses. They were meant to record men only, adult men. So the fact that we even have a mention of the fact that the house was by Mrs. Lake is actually a pretty rare thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about the rarity of that in a second. And that, this is Jade's writing. When I examined the census and the city directory data, it became clear to me that the character of the residency changed dramatically between 1853 and 1867. By 1853, the number of individuals who listed 27 to 29 Endicott Street as their residence in Boston City Directory dropped. The following year, 12 single females, first Mary Adams and after 1857, Louisa Cohen, were listed as a primary residence of the property with no occupation reported. In 1959, an anonymous author under the pen name A Free Lover included the property in a gentleman's, quote, sporting guide or guidebook of houses of prostitution, specifically in New York, but included other prominent East Coast cities. In his description of New York houses of prostitution, Lover devoted considerable space to the description of amenities available at various brothels, judging them and judging the charms and attractions of the madams and the young women employed at them, often with highly critical eye. In the 2729 Endicott Street brothel appears at the top of Lover's list of only 6 recommended brothels in Boston, despite the wide variety of venues devoted to the sex trade in the city during the time. 3 of the 6 brothels that Lover recommends has Endicott Street addresses, although we would consider the main red light district at this time would have been North Street over by the Paul Revere House and closer to a town dock in Faneuil Hall. 3 of the 6 brothels Lover recommends had Endicott Street addresses. The other 3 brothels were listed in the West End. So this is one of the researches that she was able to actually pinpoint the fact that this amazing 19th century privy was in fact a brothel. So there are 3 madams that she was able to document on the site from 1850 to 1870: Mary Adams, Louisa Cohen, and Mary Lake. This is an 1865 state census, which didn't care if they were men or women. They recorded everybody, which is great because we were able to get Louisa Cohen at the very top, and the women who are actually the prostitutes at the brothel. I've talked to Jade a lot about this because we really want to do some research on who each of these individual women are. And the consensus is that the likelihood of these folks having released their actual names is pretty low. Possibly even their ages being underrepresented and even their origin. So we're not sure if any of this information is true or if these are actual people's names that we can do more research on to find out who they are. And most likely they were giving false names to protect themselves essentially and their background stories. So there was actually quite a few pieces of jewelry that were found in the privy, including the black cross in the middle that I'm going to talk about. So Jade continues on in page 207 of her dissertation. This black glass cross is intriguing. In a line in Louisa Cohen's last will and testament, she leaves her older sister, Mary Ann Perry, all of her, quote, black jewelry. It is possible that the cross was originally part of Louisa's black jewelry collection. Louisa's will also describes other elements of personal adornment that did not make it into the archaeological record, including 3 plaid dresses, a bonnet, and a cloak that she left to her sister-in-law, Amarilla. The 2 bracelets and neck chains that she left to her niece Denise, and a gold cross that she left to the final madam at 2729 Endicott Street, Mary Lake. And actually in this census record from 1865, you can see Mary Lake on the list 2/3 of the way down. She inherited, I think in her late 20s, the brothel from Louisa and became a very wealthy and important member of the Bostonian society because of the success of her business, really. Jay continues in her analysis of Louisa's will and some of the after effects of Louisa and her later life. The things that she was able to find actually include generous gifts to Louisa's sisters and a generous gift to her brother, but actually for the service and care of their mother. And what Jade interprets from that is that the focus of Louisa and her later years was to lift up the women in her lives, her sister and her mother, and actually benefited them more than her brothers. Her profession as a prostitute and later as a madam did not destroy her family relationships. Furthermore, the wealth that she had from her job and independence afforded her and her female descendants a more comfortable lifestyle. This site we could talk about for the next year, and I highly recommend reaching out to Jade for other speaking engagements because she's fantastic at this, talking about the site and just a really exciting thing. She's now currently the director of collections at the curator of the collections of the Plymouth Plantation. We're really excited for her. All right, last site. We've got some time left, which is great. So one of our digs that we did in, I think, 2015 was the Dorchester Industrial School for Girls, which is an 1850s house that you can see here that was built purposely to bring girls to Dorchester by wealthy women that were running the school, and then train the girls in domestic service so that they could then be placed in homes as essentially servants, and more or less directly competing with Irish immigrants and Canadian Irish immigrants that were coming to America for that same purpose. But these were supposed to be essentially a training vo-tech school for young girls in destitute conditions to get these opportunities and get paid domestic labor during the early phases of the rise of converting domestic work into paid women's work. This is what we actually found on the left. It was a 5-meter long privy, which is the biggest privy we've ever found in Boston. Based on that, I think that the overall style of the privy is like what we see in this New York City privy, which is a multiple bay privy with individual stalls that had doors that you can get into from the outside. Could have been one long bench. I don't think they had a lot of privacy issues on this site in particular, but I think this is probably most likely the style, with the individual doors accessible on the right side, because the left side is actually a larger foundation for a carriage house. We found thousands of artifacts, another site I could talk about all day. All the doll parts on the left that we were able to recover, including a small statue of a crying child. That always makes you feel good about a girls' school when there's statues of crying children. And then a truly astonishing collection of ceramics. Nothing very fancy, because again, this was a girls' school, destitute girls, but a truly astonishing quantity, and most of it refit into complete vessels. This is about halfway through our refitting. Most of that went back together during about 6 months of gluing and taping that we did. But what was exciting about the site from an 1850s, because it was from the 1850s, we had truly astonishing amounts of archival documentation and fantastic genealogical research. So we were able to go to the state library at the State House and get the annual reports from the Industrial School for Girls. And you can see on the right some of those reports in their individual sleeves, which we photographed every page of, and have some fantastic volunteers photographing the entire reports on the left in the state library. We were also able to find that the Gottlieb Library at BU had an amazing set of original records from the industrial school, which was later purchased by the Home for Little Wanderers. And those documents ended up getting donated to the archives. We were actually able to look at the intake records. So this is the digitized version of the intake records. And we were actually able to find every girl that entered the school from 1853 to 1876. Just as an incredible historic documentation to go along with the site. The name of the girls, the day they entered, the day they left, and some comments. And in total, during that 25-year period, we were able to find 196 girls that passed through the school and may have left the artifacts behind. And then just as a side note, I want to talk about some of these kind of erasures and lacking of history that we get and sometimes with these documents. On the left, you have an 1880 census where the census worker went to the property and recorded every single person in the house. And you can see at the top, we have the people that were running the school. We have a superintendent of the school, an assistant, a cook, and a seamstress. And then all of the girls listed below by their age, most of them of tweens in age. And these are folks that were later going to be placed in homes that were coming in from all around New England and some of this mid-Atlantic area. That same year, tax record on the right, because the tax records were only recording adult men, all we get is a line item that says Industrial School for Girls. That's it. There's no other record of it. And this is one of the challenges we have with the historic record, where who's writing the history for whom, for what purpose, and for what audience. We have an erasure of people that we know for a fact are present in the school, but they're just not being recorded in the tax documents. The tax documents, which are every single year. And if we had all the women and children recorded in these tax documents, we would have incredible amounts of data about who's in each place, especially for the more itinerant populations and immigrants that are in different parts of the city, where we only have the men's and adult men's names. This is a piece of data that we would love to have, but we only really get that complete picture every 10 years in the census, or every 5 years for the few Massachusetts state censuses that happened in the 1850, 55, 65, and I think 75. So what happened? We ended up getting partnering with Jane Becker at UMass Boston, who teaches a practical class on public history. So Dr. Becker was able to work with us and her students to put together this website called the Dorchester Industrial School for Girls.wordpress.com, and we'll share the link to that at the end, so you don't have to scramble to write it down. And the goals of the class was, because it was a public history class, was to really try to unlock the stories of the individual girls, since we have so much information about these girls, their names and where they came from, but we really wanted to find out what happened to them after they left the school. And so one of the things that we were able to do was do biographies of the individual girls that were in the school. We don't have all of them. I think we have about 15 or so, and you can see the list here. But I really wanted to focus on one exceptionally good, they're all great, but this one had an exceptionally good ending that I wanted to talk about, because not many of these girls unfortunately met very, very tough lives and had very tragic endings to their lives. But one in particular that was done by Rick Butler had a very complete story that through genealogy was able to be brought all the way to the present, because ultimately that's what we really want to do, is have this matter to folks that are alive today. So we're going to talk about Della Collins, and I'm going to actually read you, it's a little bit pared down from what he wrote, but some of the things about what Rick was able to find about Della Collins during his research. This is going to be the last thing we're going to talk about today. So Della spent 2 years at the school without recorded behavior issues until 1865 when Lucy, I think I skipped a part here. Yeah, let's start at the beginning, shall we? Della Collins was a woman of many names. Indeed, Della was already the third iteration of her name when she was admitted to the school at just 4 years old in 1862. Della was born Delphi Collins on February 13, 1858 in Sandwich, Massachusetts, to Charles Collins, a cooper, and Sarah Collins. Tragically, Charles died of tuberculosis months before Della's birth, leaving her mother alone to raise Delphi and her siblings. By the age of 2, Delphi, which is recorded as Delpha, a second name, was living in the Sandwich town almshouse or town farmhouse with her 40-year-old mother, who was listed as insane. In 1887, an inspector found that the Sandwich almshouse was, quote, woefully unfit for occupancy, and noted that the inmates were filthy and barefooted. Sadly, it is unlikely that the conditions were much better during Della's 2 years there. When she left to join the industrial school in 1862, it was likely the last time that she ever saw her mother. Sarah Collins, Della's mother, remained at the Sandwich almshouse alone and presumed insane until her death in 1895. On October 14, 1862, Della was admitted to the Dorchester Industrial School for Girls under the intake record of Della. The schools accepted destitute girls, and Della's home in an almshouse made her an ideal candidate. At the industrial school, Della was exposed to the unique philosophies of teaching, charity, and gender roles that were developed out of Victorian reform movements of the time. She also received an education as well as her training in domestic skills such as sewing that could provide her with a job later in life. We actually found tons and tons of artifacts related to sewing on this site. Della spent 2 years at the school without any recorded behavior issues, which is rare for these girls, until 1865 when Lucy A. Fisher and her husband John, a stonecutter in Boston, adopted Della. The Fishers chose to change the 7-year-old name to Alice, and the three moved to Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire. Sadly, the Fishers returned Della, or Alice, to the industrial school just 2 years later, claiming that she had become troublesome. Della's records, written by the school manager, state that Della was, quote, in a much altered in appearance and had evidently been neglected. So Della was really having a tough life. Della's experience with the Fishers, returning her identity back to Della Collins, she remained at the school for another 2 years before being adopted by another family, Clarissa Webster and her husband Benjamin Pillsbury Webster of Fremont, New Hampshire in 1869. The Websters were in their 60s when they adopted Della. In 1870, now under the name Ella Collins, Della is listed as attending school. On December 24th, 1879, now remember she's been adopted twice now and her mother doesn't die until 1895. So one of the things the school did was have the parents turn over authority and sometimes the legal authority of parentage over to the school, so that in many cases they were actually adopting these children out, even if the parents were still alive. On December 24th, 1879, Della married Arthur T. Smith of Fremont, New Hampshire, and took her sixth and final name, Ella F. Smith. This is where things get really exciting, because so far, this is the only known photograph of any of the girls that attended the school. And Rick was able to actually get to the point where he found living descendants of Ella, where the rest of the story comes from, who had a photograph of Della Collins. So this, you can imagine this woman as a young girl in the industrial school for girls, using the outhouse and attending school in Dorchester, where the story originated. So Della and her husband Arthur lived in Fremont, where Arthur worked as a joiner and Ella kept house, a status that she maintained for the rest of her days. On August 21st, 1885, she gave birth to a son, Arthur Leon Smith. By 1900, the family were living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where Arthur Sr. worked as a train conductor for the Electric Railroad and later as a night watchman at a button factory. Eventually, the Smiths settled down at 1264 Islington Street in Portsmouth. During this time, Ella became very active in the International Order of the King's Daughters and Sons through her church, the Middle Street Baptist. The King's Daughters and Sons was a 19th century charitable organization founded by Protestant women as a means to organize charitable works and create a, quote, sisterhood of service. The motto of the order was, look up and not down, look forward and not back, look out and not in, and lend a hand. Ella was also a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, which is the only Masonic order to accept women members. Active in her community, Ella's frequent appearance in the Portsmouth newspaper, where she noted for her works in the King's and Daughters charitable events. Perhaps the harshness of her early life inspired Ella to help others, Or perhaps the reform movement teachings of the Dorchester Industrial School had a long-lasting effect on Ella's views toward public service. Sadly, in 1922, Ella's husband, Arthur, died of chronic kidney disease. After this, her son, Arthur Leon, and his wife, Ella Florence Smith, moved in with her to 1264 Islington Street. Ella continued her active role in community events through her church until her death on October 24th, 1944, at the age of 87. Oops. She is interred at the family plot in Harmony Grove Cemetery, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Portsmouth Herald states that Ella's funeral was well attended by the captain of New Hampshire State Police and assistant postmaster, among many others, as her pallbearers, and it was why they attended. Ella Smith, born Delphi Collins, rose from tragic beginnings to become a respected, charitable, and active member of her community. So Rick did, I think, a fantastic job piecing together huge quantities of genealogical data to be able to flesh out the story of who Della was. We also have many other archaeologists that have been working on this project, including folks that have been looking at dolls and buttons and things that were left behind to see kind of how the girls were reacting in the school. And what we were able to find is that the women that were running the school had a lot of control over the girls, but we also find a lot of resistance by these young girls in the form of destroying their dolls, ceremoniously, we think, inside the outhouse, but also trying to, but being forced to conform to clothing requirements by the school. So there was a lot of kind of resistance and acceptance that was happening by these girls as they were being trained to become domestic servants, essentially. So the artifacts that we dig up, they provide us the opportunity to open doors to new history. They provide us with the primary and unique data that help fill the gaps that remain in written records. And they also help to guide us into interpretation of the artifacts in history that would otherwise not be possible without this data. Most importantly, when it comes to archaeology, it's not about this stuff, it's in fact about this story. So thank you all so much for coming. I think we have plenty of time for questions, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Joe. First of all, we were getting some interference in the background on your side. I'm not sure if something's going on over there, but I do apologize for any sound issues that anyone might have had. So let's see, if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat or turn on your microphones. So for starters, let's see what we have first. Okay, hold on. Okay, let's see. So Han asks, can you repeat your colleague Kathleen's research study title, something about engendered space? Is it available somewhere for the public to access?
So the event that we did was not a published thing. So I don't know if it's available. I think Kathleen's actually in attendance. So maybe she can provide us with some information and maybe share the thing. It was 2018, Boston Latin School, a look at ethnic and engendered spaces. And there's a presentation at the 2018 annual meeting of the Society for Historical Archaeology. So Kathleen, maybe if you're listening, we can get a copy of your paper and presentation and have it emailed out to the attendees.
Okay. All right, so let's see. So Heather asks, can you explain more about why people throw so much trash in the privies? There was no real garbage system. Was there no real garbage system then?
Yeah, up until about 1890 or so, we really don't have any systematic trash collection. So your choices for your trash were you could dig a hole and bury it, you could throw it in the ocean, which even back then wasn't considered very good, or you could throw it in your outhouse. And the outhouse basically had was a hole already in the ground, so it was easy to fill up. The problem was that you would fill up your outhouse with your human manure and waste, and so you would have to clean it out regularly. So there was laws in place that actually said you don't throw your trash in your outhouse, because you would pay what's called the night soils man to come and empty out your outhouse, and then they would resell that human manure. Since it was all organic back then, you could sell it to farmers and use it as fertilizer. But if it was filled with garbage, you really couldn't do that. So what those folks were then forced to do, because farmers wouldn't pay for those privy contents, was they would have to then dump it somewhere. And in Boston, we were doing a lot of what's called wharfing out, where you're filling in land around the wharfs, around the shoreline. So there's always some place to dump the artifacts and the night soils, the privy contents somewhere. But it was not a profitable experience for the folks that you were paying to empty out your outhouse. So you weren't supposed to do it. Fortunately for archaeologists, everybody broke that rule. Otherwise, we wouldn't have as much to do. But that was one of the rules that was there. In fact, the Faneuil Hall site, which is Faneuil Hall's built on fill, the archaeologists that dug that in the 90s and 2010s were able to basically prove through looking at seeds that had been partially digested that the majority of the fill that was brought in to fill Faneuil Hall was privies from all over the city being dumped at Faneuil Hall at Town Dock in order to make the land that Faneuil Hall has been built upon. So essentially, Faneuil Hall is built on top of a massive outhouse deposit. Unfortunately, it's everybody's stuff, so we don't get as much of an individual story, but it would be the equivalent of if we went to a landfill today and looked at all the artifacts there, which people have done. You get a holistic story of a neighborhood or a community, but you don't get an individual story, but there's still a lot there that you can really learn from what was going on.
Okay, so Simone asks, can you say more about the possibility of the girls at the home in Dorchester ritualistically destroying their dolls? What info suggested that possibility?
So that's Sarah Johnson's work, and I got to recall how it went, but she was able to basically statistically prove that the dolls well, one of the things that she was trying to prove was whether or not the dolls were being provided to the girls or whether they were bringing the dolls with them to the house. And what she was able to show through the documentation was that the dolls were being given to the girls. So one of the fundamental questions was these dolls they were smashed into pieces and in the outhouse, which we could say that they were being destroyed, but we didn't know why. And so that's one of the things that was a given, was the destruction. We believe that Sarah Johnson believes that and I agree with her, that the destruction was happening because these dolls were being seen as part of the outside forces that were being placed upon these girls by the managers of the school itself, because they weren't being brought in with them. And while they were meant to be something that the girls would value, that because they weren't coming from their home and they weren't their personal possessions, they were being essentially instituted, these dolls. We believe that was one of the ways that the girls were able to show some resistance, was to take these things and destroy them. At least that's one of the interpretations. Okay. And Sarah spent 100-something pages of her thesis trying to prove that. So it's a little bit more detailed than that. Sarah Johnson's thesis is available online from UMass Boston master's theses. So you can read the whole thing and see her arguments there too.
Great. So Leslie asks, what has been done with the digs you show in the photographs?
So right now, all of the artifacts, every single artifact that I showed this evening is being housed at the City Archaeology Laboratory. Most of these websites, or most of these projects have websites now where we have complete reports. And so basically our goal in our reports is to explain everything that we did in the dig and to provide a really thorough analysis of what was found on these sites and what the interpretation of those sites are. That said, there's always more to do. So what we try to do is we keep the artifacts as though you would keep a book from a library, or we keep them like pages of a library book, where we actually are trying to keep the data so that folks can come in and ask different questions than what we were asking when we did the dig originally. So maybe somebody's going to come in and compare the industrial school in Dorchester to an industrial school somewhere else, possibly in another country. We had some in Australia that was doing that. So our goals really are just to have the fundamental data available to researchers, but our reports are able to give the fundamentals of what was being found and what we interpret, and then we take it from there.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Teresa asks, she says, one of her husband's family names is Estes. Do you recall any digs for Mathers or Estes families?
The Mathers, we actually do have some stuff. I don't know about the Estes, but the Mathers were living at the Paul Revere house before Paul Revere bought it, quite a long time before Paul Revere bought it. Increase in Cotton Mather lived there. So we actually have a decent number of 17th century artifacts from the household of Cotton and Increase Mather. That collection is one of our NEH grants that we're actively recataloging and getting ready to put online, in addition to Boston Common, Faneuil Hall, and Brook Farm, a Transcendentalist Utopian Society. So we'll be able to share all of those artifacts and the reports within the next 6 months. We should be having all that digitized and online. So that's one of our biggest projects, is to get this data online and get it out there.
Okay, great. So I have a couple of follow-up questions about the dolls. One person's asking, couldn't the dolls be destroyed by the instructors to keep the girls in line? Another person asks, or the dolls just broke frequently because they were fragile?
Yeah, I mean, all those are viable options. I think our biggest issue with the dolls is we have two fundamental trash deposits on the site. We have a deposit of every single thing that seemed to be from the main house itself, which included all those dishes that you saw. And then we have a trash deposit in the privy, which includes buttons, pins, personal items from the girls, and the dolls. So we're actually interpreting the fact that these artifacts end up in the outhouse is that they are primarily the girls themselves, putting these artifacts in the outhouse, either throwing them in them or dropping them, which is where we think a lot of the buttons end up, just falling off clothing, and all the pins too being tossed down there. So there seems to be a distinction between the function of the two deposits, and we think that the main deposit of the dishes in the yard was the deposit that was created and really managed by the school people that ran the school itself, because it seems like that's where they wanted the trash to go. The outhouse represents a totally different story. But yeah, you're right. It could just be they broke a lot. We're looking at 25 years of history. There's a lot of things that can break over 25 years. But Sarah makes a really compelling argument in her report, and I highly recommend that folks look into it.
Great. Okay, so we have a few questions about your digs. One person wants to know, where is your next dig? Another person wants to know, is there an online blog to show progress on digs?
There isn't an online blog. We do have a social media platform that we post a lot of updates on, especially during the digs themselves, where you can follow in like almost real time. The next dig is nowhere. I have no idea where it's going to be, because right now, obviously from COVID, we had a lot of things shut down. We actually didn't have a lot of planned this year, but we had nothing come up either. And I anticipate that because a lot of the work that we're doing tends to be directly related to nonprofit organizations doing work on their properties, that given some of the major challenges that nonprofits are going to be having over the next couple of years, there may not be as much development projects happening or improvements on landscapes. So we may actually see a slowdown in some of our projects. That said, there's a lot of other things that are coming up, bigger developments that are happening in the city, a lot of things happening on public land that I'm actively looking at. So I think you'll see some digs coming up, possibly this year. I'm not going to disclose where yet, but you'll see them when they happen. Because we are actively looking at permit applications for digs in Boston in at least 2 different places that you will definitely hear about where they happen.
Great.
But I won't be digging them. Other people will be digging them. I'm part of the regulations of it, not the actual field crew doing it, which is good because I don't have any volunteers because we can't do it safely right now.
Right on. Yeah, that's hard for everyone right now. Okay, let's see. So Karen asks, in another program about archaeology, it was pointed out that it can take quite a long time for artifacts from digs to finally get to the point of being displayed because of all the steps in between, cataloging, analyzing, etc. How long would you say this process typically takes for the sites you've worked on?
For us, it's about 3 to 5 years, unfortunately. What ends up happening is we do a lot of digging in the summer, and we try to get everything cataloged by the end of the fall and the winter, and we're usually really good about that. The challenge for me is that I'm the person who writes the reports, and if I'm not digging and I'm not working on reviewing projects and I'm not running grants and I'm not writing grants, then that's when I get a chance to write my reports. And so things really bog down when it gets into my hands completely. So most of our collections right now, in fact, all the ones that I've dug or ran the digs of, we have fully cataloged and digitized what we found. What we don't have is the report that tells anybody outside of us who are on the site what actually happened. So that's something that I'm working on. I have about 6 outstanding reports right now. Now that I've got the book that's coming out next year, that's done, so I could focus on more writing projects, but it seems like every time we have a couple minutes to write, something else comes up and we run off to something else. So it's one of the challenges that we have with the program. It's just there's a lot of people, there's very few people doing a whole lot of stuff, and so that's really kind of bogging things down, unfortunately. But the Industrial School for Girls site is completely done. The Latin School site is completely done. You can see the report and everything online. The Washington Garden site, the privy that Megan Sheehan's looking into, that is not done. It's mostly done, but it's not done. And Jade's is completely done as well. But we're averaging about 3 or 4 years per site to get to from soup to nuts.
Great. Okay, so I have a couple people asking about your online presence. Teresa wants to know, where will the Mather information be online? And a couple people want to know, what social media platforms are you guys using?
So I will put that in the chat. So actually we can send it out later too, but the Mather data will be on boston.gov/archaeology. I can type and talk at the same time. So that, oops, no, I just sent it to you, sorry.
Okay.
Let's do that again. We'll send you out more links. And then all of our social media, we're doing Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's at Boston Archeo. And I just posted that as well. So you can follow us through those two things. So the boston.gov/archaeology, each one of our sites will get an individual page, and you'll see all of the sites listed on that page, and you can kind of check out each one as you go. And then we're systematically updating each page as we get more information. So we finish our cataloging first, and then we post the catalog. Then we do all the photographs, the artifacts, and we post that. So we kind of go in order as things finish. So not every site is done at once. It's kind of updated as we go. You can kind of follow along there.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's see. So Heather is asking, just wondering what types of seeds are being found in the prairies. What were they eating?
Yeah, that's one of the most exciting things about these digs is the food. So it depends on where we are, and it depends on when we are. For the most part, the seeds at the Industrial School for Girls were things like figs and raspberry, just a huge quantity of raspberries. We have a lot of berries in Dorchester, frankly. Strawberry seeds, and mostly fruit seeds, essentially. The bones that we recovered from the Industrial School, which is mostly chicken and fish, and I think some large beef from like stewing beef. But there's actually someone, Allie Crowder, who's done an entire study on the food of the Industrial School for Girls, and I believe that's in the report that's online for the Industrial School. So there's a link that's going to go out for the, well, you can find it on the boston.gov/archaeology page, and go into full details of that. The site in the north end had a lot more fig and raspberries than we would have thought. And we get a lot of grape seeds. And I'm starting to get a little bit better about identifying the seeds as we find them. But it looks kind of like the ground, when it's really dense with seeds, can look almost like quinoa, even though it's not quinoa, but it has that texture of boiled quinoa when the seeds are really dense on these sites. I just want to do a quick shout out to Jane Becker, who's posting some really great data in the chat. If you want to check that out, Jane was the professor in charge of the class that did the Industrial School for Girls project. And just an incredible amount of work that the group of students had done. So you want to check out some of those links too.
Okay, so I think that covers everything that was in the chat. Anyone else has any questions? We still have a little bit of time.
I apologize for the sound stuff. I wasn't aware. My bad.
Okay. So we have a few people have said thank you. Oh, Teresa says figs, Italians maybe.
Yeah, and the hard thing about figs is that you want to always figure out like how many figs are people eating, because that seems kind of fancy, but then figs are also one of those things that one fig produces a huge quantity of seeds, especially if you're eating them. So one of the challenges with the figs in particular was trying to figure out how many figs are really represented. By like 10,000 figs might be 5 figs. So yeah.
Cool. Okay, so all right, so I can answer this one. So this is being recorded, so this will be going up on YouTube in a day or so. So this will be online eventually. So let's see. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so all right. So like I said, we still got a couple of minutes. Anyone has anything? Also, if you have any, there, Joe just put his email in there. If you have any questions about anything related to the library, you can email us at ask@bpl.org.
Thank you everybody for saying.
Great, and well, all right, so I think that's about it. So I'm gonna stop the recording and we can wrap this up. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for all the great questions, and thank you, Joe. That was a great presentation, and despite the sound issues, it was really interesting.
Thanks, I appreciate that.